fellow alumni, fellow alumnus in the world, and most importantly, Millbrook students, it's an immense honor and a tremendous privilege to be here today as your Veterans Day speaker. First of all, I owe you an apology. So it was here and then it wasn't there at the theater, which I understand really nice. It was back here. It's my fault. And as a joke, I sent an email to Cindy McWilliams, and she said, well, do you need anything? I said, I'm going to send some clips. I was in a movie for like 15 seconds when I was here. I don't know if you've seen it, a little pretty dark. So as a joke, I said to Cindy I was going to show that as part of my presentation. And Reverend Hardy, being the thoughtful person she is, thought, oh, we'll set that up. So we can do that. And sorry about that. So if you got back and forth, I'm glad to have you here. It is really cool to be back here in the Millbrook School Chapel. I mean, you have no idea what a good-looking student body. What a big student body compared to we were. So this is like a bucket list thing for me. So on my list of things I always wanted to do is I used to want to be on the Jon Stewart show. I didn't get a chance to that. I used to think someday I'd be on the Colbert Report. I didn't get a chance to that. So this is kind of in the top 5. Another thing I wanted to do was to beat up a kid I went to Millbrook with, but I saw him the other night in New York. We had a little feud, but it turns out he's such a nice guy now. And my wife was with me, can't do that. So my advice, if you want to be advice, if you have a feud with anybody here, settle it before you leave, because it gets really hard to settle it down the road. Something you should know. So a bunch of people from my class and some of your parents were at this reception last night. And a bunch of people from my class, I guess, have students here, whose children were students here. And each of your parents said, I'm going to check with my son or daughter and see how you did. So my favorite I ask of you is if you talk to parents, tell them I did great, no matter how I do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, as Rick said. And first of all, Andre, thank you. I probably can't top what Andre said. I met Andre's mom last night in New York, and your words were quite moving. Thank you. Very impressive. So, Bob Anthony, where's Bob? Bob, are you here? Good. Everybody else was drinking, right? Bob was my advisor, my faculty advisor, when I was here at the school. Bob was recognized last night for being, it's either the second or first longest serving member of the Millbrook faculty. First or second. Anyway, it's long. And so, you got a big round of applause. I'd like everybody, please, for me, give Bob a big round of applause. They were my groom parents in South Hall, which is now called Harris Hall, for I think 2 of the 3 years that I was here. Rick, as you all know, is retiring. Best soccer coach, best dorm master I ever had, my photography teacher. Big hand for Rick, please. So Rick is totally exaggerating. He says that I was part of laying the groundwork for the successful team that won a bunch of games after I graduated. That's what you say when you're being nice to somebody. But Rick actually gave me some advice when I was in school. And I saw you earlier, but I didn't mention. So we were walking up the hill to what you now call Harris Dorm from soccer practice. And we were talking about something. I think it was applying colleges and trying to figure it out. And so Rick gave me this advice. He said, you know, anyone can get straight A's if they really try. The only important thing is to know that you could if you wanted to. And I thought, that is a really weird thing for a teacher to say to a student. It makes no sense, though. You really say that. And it turns out, it really is good advice. Like, as you go on in life, it turns out, you know, you don't always get straight A's, but you should know that you could if you really needed to. And so I was leaving the thing at the Racket Club last night, which was very nice. Bob pulled me aside, and he said, hey, Josh, I know you're going to be great, but just try not to be too acerbic like you were when you were a student here. Right? Acerbic. Right? And I thought of myself as acerbic. Like, I thought irreverent, like reverent's a good thing, right? Acerbic, that's a bad thing. So everyone has a sense of themselves, right? And it turns out you see somebody 30 years later, they do you better than you knew yourself when you were that self. And so I also want to say, all kidding aside, with no trace of acerbicness, I'm really impressed that Millbrook has a Veterans Day program. And I understand, Rick, you were very instrumental in starting it. And I'm truly honored to be here today to speak on this very nice occasion. I'm not really sure exactly what previous speakers discussed. My focus today might be a little bit different. I'm going to endeavor today to connect the ethos of Millbrook service and my experience here to my own experience, both during my military service and following, to hopefully give you some context and something to think about for yourselves as you consider what it means to serve or possibly serve. But just as importantly, to consider those who have served or currently serve. So it's great to be here. I graduated in 1982. This is actually only the third time I've been back to Millbrook ever since then. I'm sitting there, we're talking, it's not because I don't love Millbrook, it's just I live in California now, and my travels have not taken me here, so it's thrilled to be here. When I was here, and this is why it's included in the chapel, I was the president of the student body, as Rick mentioned, and I remember really well standing up right above the clock, I guess that's where seniors stood during the assembly, and being really, really nervous to make announcements like, there's a student council meeting today at 3 p.m. That would be so nervous. Who's the student council president? Where are you? Where is this person? You don't have one? Dude, wait a minute. See, that's that. So I'm sure I had some role in that. Really? Okay, was it coup or something? Okay, that's all right. Interesting. Well, it makes sense. I don't really remember getting anything of substance done in my capacity as student body president. I really don't. But I do remember making announcements, and I was nervous. And I also remember that a lot, apparently, when we stood up there, we all stood in the chapel, right? Because apparently a lot else went on in the chapel when I was in Millbrook. And so you apparently didn't want to sit on cushions. I don't know if that's still true. But more importantly, the last time I was here was for my baccalaureate address, which is the address you go to before your graduation. And that was now more than 30 years ago. And our class's baccalaureate address speaker was a fellow named William Sloan Coughlin Jr. He was a reverend. And our headmaster at the time was a terrific guy named Don Abbott, who had graduated himself from Millbrook in 1959, and who, when he graduated, Reverend Coughlin was actually his baccalaureate speaker back then also. And then the Reverend went on to be the Dean of the Divinity School at Yale, and he was very involved and had a very hard profile during the Vietnam War as part of the protest against the Vietnam War. And so when I graduated in 1982, that was really only 7 or so years after the end of the Vietnam War. And I remember at the time there were a bunch of parents who were kind of tisking about that man, like how is that man our speaker? But he gave a talk that impressed me in a way that I'm sure that most speeches haven't. And I want to touch on it a little bit. And actually, I was having a couple years ago with another classmate, a guy named Lars Murray, who's now a big music industry executive. So he knows like Jack White, New Direction. So this is a guy who doesn't have a speech. You want that guy, right? You love that guy. But he and I were talking about this speech that the Reverend gave, and he had the same impression, and I'll get to that in a second. So I called up Bob Anthony, and I said, hey, do you have like renders and speeches? And so Bob said, well, and I told him what I was looking for in line. And he said, well, let me check the archives. We'll check the archives. And I really, and then he said he checked the archives, right? But couldn't find it. And I'm still not convinced there really is an archives, right? Like maybe there's a drawer at Bob's desk, or there's a closet somewhere. But I appreciate him saying he checked. And so I, thinking this guy was fairly prominent, I got on the internet, did a little Googling, and it turns out that this guy, the Reverend himself, in addition to being very wise, he was very efficient. That dude gave the same speech everywhere he went. And so I found it, he gave it apparently at Willamette College in 2001. I found a video of it at Lakeland College in Texas in 1997. And he even actually incorporated the same speech into a book he wrote called Letters to a Young Town. But it really was a good speech. And let me just give you the good stuff. So the gist of his talk was this. In life, right, especially in American life these days, there's really no shortage of forces or institutions or people who, if you let them, will gladly tell you who you are and what you're worth. And his message, sort of thinking about that, was this, which is no matter how strong the pressure or the temptation, you should never let anybody else tell you who you are, or especially what you do. And so he started out with an anecdote, which I thought you'd appreciate, especially since I found his speech. The kind that any lower 5th or 6th former will probably appreciate. about how when he was chaplain at Yale and seniors who were applying for admission to grad programs would come to him for recommendations, he would tell them the following. So let me give you just a little excerpt of his speech. So he wrote, or he said, "Immodestly let me report that I wrote brilliant letters of recommendation to such highfalutin institutions of higher education as the Columbia Medical School or the Harvard Law School. I would often say, dear Dean of Admission, this candidate will undoubtedly be in the bottom quarter of your class. But surely you will agree with me that the bottom quarter should be as carefully selected as the top quarter. And for what you would be looking for in the bottom quarter, if not the sterling extracurricular characteristics so eminently embodied in this candidate, I heartily recommend it. And I would list them conscientious, will seek the common good, not private gain, etc. I would then show the letter to the student. You're not going to believe this, the Reverend said, but invariably the student's feelings were hurt. How do you know, they would say, that I'm going to be in the bottom quarter? Well, all the evidence is pretty much in, isn't it? Well, you didn't have to tell them, they would say. So there you are, you see what's going on. Just to get into a place like Yale, you have to be in the 95th percentile. To graduate, you have to be in the 96th. To get into medical school, Harvard Law School, you have to be in the 98th. Just because I didn't say they would be in the 99th percentile, and never mind that I said that they would be conscientious, seek not private gain, but serve the common good, they clearly felt inferior, such as the power of institutions of higher education to tell you who you are. But then he got to the point, and he said this, and this is what stuck with me. Some people need money to tell them who they are. Some people need power to tell them who they are. Some people need enemies, and some people even let their own mistakes tell them who they are. But in the end, he said, and it made sense to me then and still makes sense to me now, the real answer to that question is not letting anyone else tell you who you are or what you're worth. It's far less important to be successful than it is to be valuable. And that making money isn't the key to that value, but making a difference is. And what's the most direct, most lasting way to make the difference? It's through service. So I went to private school and public school when I came to Millbrook as a fourth former. And every school has a motto. And of course, any school that's striving for prestige has a Latin motto. And Millbrook, as you all know, your motto is non sibi sed cunctus. And if you look it up on your website, it translates it. And it says on the website, the school's motto encapsulates the true spirit of Millbrook. Students who faculty alike strive not only to better themselves intellectually and emotionally, but also to give back to the community through stewardship and service. So when you're a student here, that whole community service thing can sometimes seem like an excuse for not paying for things like other normal schools do. When I was here, we had dishwashing duty. We'd always find ourselves asking each other, like, what kind of school charges parents all this money and it makes the students do dishes? Or trust them with the school post office or the bank or the fire department. And as you move forward, it turns out all these little things added up, right? That they weren't just being cheap. Millbrook has a plan, and they really do know what they're doing. And so you might not realize it at first, but Millbrook's ethos of community service, of non-suicide companies, it's going to have a much larger, greater impact than you might guess. And as you get further out into the world, that experience of doing, of seeing things from the inside, through that lens of community service, will give you a different, better understanding of how the world works and how it's all connected from people. When I was a senior, about to graduate from college at Yale, I was coming home one day from class, and I ran into a guy named Jeff Brooks as he was heading out the gate of residential college, just as I was going in. And it was like 2 in the afternoon on a fall day, and he was wearing like a suit, like my suit, my three-piece suit. And I said, hey Jeff, what's up with the suit? And he said, I'm headed to the Career Advisory Placement Service building because all the big investment banks are on campus this week, interviewing. So my dad was a doctor, and I knew nothing about how the world of business worked. So I said to Jeff, like, hey, okay, if you work for an investment bank, what does somebody do, you graduate from college, when you go to work for an investment bank right out of college? So Jeff said, well, if you go live in New York City, and you work like 80 or 90 hours a week, and if you did a decent job, after a couple of years, they'd help you get into business or law school. So I said, well, okay, can you just apply to business or law school directly without doing all that? And he looked at me like I was an idiot, and he said, so what are you going to do when you graduate? And so I thought about it for a moment, and all I could really say at that moment was, I'm not really sure, but I'm not doing that. So around more or less the same time, I remember seeing an ad on the back cover of Sports Illustrated or Rolling Stone. Some of the banks are probably skimming what's supposed to be studying for finals fall semester. And it said something on the, to the effect of the back that I did get on, said, do you have a college degree? Are you about to get one? Because you could be an executive in the world's most successful organization, the United States Army. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. My major in college was history. My emphasis was on 20th century American history. And I'd never really been into military books or playing war games, but I had a sense at that time that our country's experience in the 20th century, through two world wars and through all the changes that had followed, had had a huge impact on successive generations of American leaders, not just in politics, but in business. And I thought that was, military service seemed interesting for that reason. And so the other thing that I was impressed by, as you consider what you do after going to college, having been to Millbrook, that I've been very fortunate, right? I've been on kind of a nice, easy path from Millbrook to Yale, and you could stay on that path, and you could wind up working in New York, going to law school, and staying kind of in the same bubble that we often live in. And doing that, I felt like you could run the risk of possibly never really seeing the world from a different vantage point, but also not really knowing if you earned it, not even knowing your own value, and which gets back to Reverend Kaufman's advice. So I think I found a phone book, back then we used a phone book, you didn't know the end. And I looked at the address for the Army Recruiting Office in New Haven, Connecticut, and it turned out it was like 4 blocks from my door. So I went down, I went through the door, in the same way that I'd never known what the recruiting office was. Apparently the recruiting office had never had a Yale student during that year walk through their door. So I walked in one day and I said, hey, I saw an ad in the back of Sports Illustrated that said, if I had a college degree, I could go to Officer Training School. And the recruiter on duty said something to that, and this is what I do. You can't just walk into this office. You don't just walk in here and become an Army officer. So I said, I explained the ad thing again. And she said, well, I'm having a little bit up. So she and a bunch of other recruiters got a bunch of books out, and they looked at all of it, and it turned out, like, yeah, I see, that was a reasonably accurate description. But she said, but first, before we do this paperwork, you got to take a pretest. And I was like, okay, I'll take a pretest. So Sergeant Watford was my recruiter's name. She took me down to the basement in this kind of dingy old building, and it had a table in the middle, like an old Apple IIe computer with a green screen and a floppy disk. And she said, take this pretest. And the pretest turned out to be kind of like a watered-down SAT. I remember there were 10 English questions and 10 math questions. So she said, I'm going to leave you alone. Let me know when you're done. And so I did them. And I went back upstairs. I said, I did them. And she said, you shouldn't get them all. And I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure I did all those questions. She said, you sure? Because you got to go a little fast. And I said, no, I'm very sure I answered all 20 questions, Sergeant Watford. So she had to take the floppy disk out and put it in another thing for the answer key. And it was like I won the jackpot in Vegas. Like, ding, ding, ding. And she said, he got them all right. Nobody's ever gotten them all right before. And he said, maybe you could be an officer. So I was like, okay, this is encouraging. So I got to go back downstairs, and I had another section where they had these videotapes of all the things you could do when you were in the military. It's all the different skills you had. So there was one for officer candidate school that apparently had never been used. And it was really grainy old footage from like the 1950s, showing a bunch of really skinny guys with totally bald heads, all running around, doing obstacle courses, getting well getting hosed down, running around. So being the smart Yale kid I just figured that was a really old tape. It was all out of date. It didn't work like that anymore. It was all good. It turns out that other than the whole black and white thing, it was exactly like that, and I'll get to that. And it turned out also it was a lot harder to sign up to join the Army than I realized. You had to get letters of recommendation. You had to go in front of a military review board. You had to take a whole bunch of other tests. And eventually, as it was, I was accepted. And then I just had to figure out how to tell my parents what I was planning on doing. And so I can still remember really clearly, I was home on spring break my senior year, and it was warm. My dad and I were out grilling steaks outside. My dad said to me, he said, so have you given any thought to what your plans might be after graduation? And I thought, oh, that's something good opening. I said, well, now funny you should ask. Even though I'd signed up, I'd taken an oath for anything. I said, I'm actually considering joining the Army and going to officer candidate school, right? And so for Bob, my dad thought I was joking. And he said, okay, seriously, have you given any thought at all to what you're doing after you graduate? And I said, knowing full well I'd already signed the paper, I really am doing that. I'm seriously considering that. And my dad looked at me and he said, man, if you're serious, I think that's terrible idea. And I thought, that's a strange, kind of odd, unpatriotic thing to say. And my dad had been a doctor, he'd been in the Army and stuff. So I said, well, what's that supposed to mean? He said, well, first of all, because I was in the Army. Okay? Second of all, I know you. And you're going to be the guy who, when they say, does anyone have any questions, you're going to be just stupid enough to have a question. And he was totally right. He was totally right. And he also figured out really quickly that I already signed it way before I told him. But my parents actually were pretty little people. And like I said, Vietnam War was actually not too far in the past. And I think they were actually not only a little displeased with my choice, but they were clearly a little embarrassed, right? Because about telling their friends a good kid was joining the military. It kind of took my folks by surprise when I graduated college, where they announced what everyone was doing the following year. Some kids were going to law school, some kids were working at Capitol Hill, some kids taking those jobs and with investment banks. And when they announced what I was doing, my friends thought I put it down as a prank. Thanks, Bob. True. But other people's parents came up with me and were very complimentary. I think that surprised my parents. It turns out that I was the only member of my graduating class of 1,200 kids to join the Army that year. And to give you a sense of the larger context, that same graduating class also sent the largest number of students into the Peace Corps that year, which was 28. So, wandered off, had to get on a bus in New Haven. I go back to New Haven, had to present my diploma from Yale to prove that I had graduated from college. Turns out there was a problem because my diploma was in Latin. And they didn't take that as a legitimate diploma because it wasn't in English. So we had to make an emergency run to the registrar's office and take my transcript and see once again all my bad grades, but they did total up to 36 credits a year. And so they accepted me. I got on a bus in New Haven and they took us to the Port Authority in New York City. I'm sure lots of you have been there. That's one of the saddest places in the world. And at the Port Authority, we got on another military bus with kids from all over the country, from places like Lincoln, Nebraska, Memphis, Tennessee. They all got on the bus. We all went from there to Fort Dix, New Jersey, where they dumped us off the bus. And it was exactly like in the movies, where the second we got off the bus, there was a drill sergeant yelling and screaming. We all stood there trying to figure out what we were doing. And I actually had brought with me a duffel bag all full of books. And they're all books that I hadn't read for whatever reason, for various courses I'd taken in college, but I always thought, I'm going to read books. And I thought, for some reason, I figured, what do they do at night when you're base training? So a lot of times sit around and read. And so the drill sergeant whom I met on the first day, he opened my duffel bag, and he looked at all my books and asked me, what the hell do you have all these books for? So I tried to explain and say, you're not going to have the time to read in basic training. He took my duffel bag and put it in the closet, and to his credit, he gave me my bag back when I left. On the second day of basic training, they took us all to get haircuts. And they lined us up, and the drill sergeant said, now look here, everybody who's got $5 in their pocket, you make one line. Anybody who doesn't have any money, you get in the other line. Guys with money, pair up with a guy with no money, and I'll make sure that when you get your first paycheck, that you get paid back your $2.15 for your Army haircut. And so, being, this is to show how naive I was, the thing that impressed me was, I was surprised we had to pay for our own haircuts, right, to get our heads shaved. And they took us all in, and they shaved our heads. And I can tell you, white guys all look bad with shaved heads. White guys. And all the guys walked around, kind of rubbed their heads for like a day. And actually, we were in New York, so I ran to a guy. There was a guy here. Anybody ever shaved your head? Really? Okay. Because when I was a student here in Millbrook, there was a guy named Tom Murray who went around one day and he asked everybody, hey, how much would you give me to shave my head? And kids were like, I'll give you $5 to shave your head. So that dude shaved his head, and it turns out, he told me the number yesterday, he made $127 to shave his head. Which he said, let him eat pizza like for the whole rest of the year. But it looked kind of scary. So you're looking like, and really how, look at this scary. So it was right before Parents' Day weekend, and the faculty asked him, like very directly, to please stay in the dorm during all the faculty weekends so as not to scare any of the parents. True story, $127. So here in the world of kind of respectable boarding school, that's a weird thing. But in the military, everybody got their head shaved. We all also got our uniforms for the first time. So you had all these kids. You had the kid from the inner city of Memphis, metalhead from Omaha, Nebraska, and you can see for the first time standing there with bald heads in our uniforms, also, in basic training. I was equal for the first time on the way down. But all these other kids were equal for probably first time in a long time, maybe ever, on the way up. They were getting to start from scratch. And so that was something that was really striking. And that's something that you get from that kind of service. About 2/3 of the way through basic training, I kept a really low profile and tried not to tell anybody where I went to college. And so about 2/3 of the way through basic training, drill sergeant called us all in his office. We had to fill out a questionnaire, and said, toward the end of it, it was about education. And so he said to me, he said, "You got a high school degree?" And I said, "Yes, drill sergeant." That's how you had to tell. I said, "Yes, no, I don't know drill sergeant." And he said, he went on, he said, "You got in college?" And I said, "Yes, drill sergeant." And he said, "Yeah, how many years college?" And I said, 4, drill sergeant. And he said, "You got a degree?" And I said, "Yes, I do, drill sergeant." And he said, "Where's the degree from?" And I said, "From Yale University, drill sergeant." And he said, "I can't swear in Chuck." So he said, "Holy freaking crap. He said, Yale freaking University." And he said, "I've never met anybody who went to Yale University." And then he said, "Isn't that expensive?" And I said, "Yes, I guess so, drill sergeant." He said, "How much it cost to you? Like 25 grand a year or something?" And that actually would be kind of a bargain today, right? But at the time, I said, "No, well, maybe 20 grand, drill sergeant." And he said, "Well, were you on a scholarship or something?" And I said, "No, drill sergeant." And he said, "Holy crap." He said, "Your parents spent 100 grand on college for you, and now you're a private in the Army?" And I said, "Well, maybe 80 grand, drill sergeant." And it all got worse from there. So for the rest of my time in basic training, my drill sergeant, every time we had a rifle range, or we had to learn how to splint a fracture, something like that, or march around, he would pull me out of everything, and he'd bring me over to all the other drill sergeants, and he'd say, "This dude out. His parents made 100 grand on him. He was private in the Army." And they'd be like, "Oh, that's awesome. Do some push-ups, 100 grand, man." And I was like a celebrity. Then I went to OCS. And again, naively, it turns out, when you go to Army Officer Candidate School, it's not like going to the Navy, it's not like that movie Officer and Gentleman. If you don't make it, you still owe the Army 3 years. And so I got caught laughing a bunch of times, and so the woman who was in charge of my platoon one day said to me, she said, "Newman, you think this is all a game, don't you?" And I knew it was just a game. But even though my dad thought it, I knew it would be really dumb to answer, "Yes, I know it's a game." So I'd say, "No, ma'am, I'm sure it's not a game." And then she started in where the whole drill was to find out how much pressure you could take, to see if you were officer material. So her thing with me was, "What are you going to do when I kick you out? You're going to be a mechanic? You're going to be a cook? Like, what are you going to do?" This would happen every day. And I thought at first, like, she can't do that. And then I realized one day, like, she can totally do that. And I would really blow to find myself kicked out of OCS and I tell all my friends that I was a cook in the Army or something like that. But I actually managed to graduate. And my first duty assignment, as Reed mentioned, was in the nuclear weapons unit in South Korea. And my unit's mission at that time, it was a special weapons unit. And our role was to work with Korean Army units all over South Korea, up and down South Korea, all the way up to the DMZ, to the border, with Korean Army units, to practice a scenario where if the North Koreans attacked us and they were winning, we would receive nuclear weapons. We would assemble those weapons. We would then link up with the Korean Army unit, and then we would fire those nuclear projectiles at the rapidly advancing North Korean border. And which sounded kind of extreme, but it was real. In Korea, where they were technically still at war, the South Koreans took it very, very seriously. After my next assignment in Hawaii, my next assignment was in Hawaii, and I had to live in Honolulu, but only when we weren't out practicing jungle warfare in a swamp somewhere with my unit. And in 2 years there, I was three-replacement alert. A bunch of times we almost deployed to the Philippines for an attempted coup. Came very close to going to Panama for the war there. And in the end, loaded up all our stuff on barges, but didn't have to go. And so I wound up finishing my active duty, got out of the Army in 1990. And it was just a couple of months before the Gulf War. And so I was still technically in the reserves. And with my background in Hawaii, where we practiced desert warfare and jungle warfare, I thought there was a pretty good chance I'd have to go. So one day, literally about a month before that war, I got a registered letter on a Saturday afternoon, and it said, "Go to the post office on Monday to register your letter." So I thought it was the Army calling me back. And gave me a good opportunity to think about where I was going and what it might be like. And I went to the post office on Monday morning, I got my letter, and it turns out I had won $25 in the Mazda Drive for Adventure sweepstakes. Now I claimed my $25. So, never served in combat. Had a good experience. Got a bunch of huge awards and citations. I wouldn't say in my time in the military I did anything super heroic, but I can tell you this. I learned more about people and the world and myself in the 4 years I was in the military than I ever did in all my schooling prior to then, and actually since then. And I actually did achieve one of my goals, which was to go out and see a part of the world, but outside that kind of prep school to college bubble that I lived in, to see what it was like to try, to see what it was like to succeed and work with people, without relying on the advantages that we sometimes take for granted. And so as you mentioned, I've done a bunch of things since. And about 4 years ago, as the recession was finally leveling off in Northern California, and unemployment rates were starting to come back down, I got interested in the question as to why, knowing what I think I know, what I know about soldiers, about military service, why unemployment rates for young vets coming home, especially young vets who don't suffer from service-related issues that would get in the way of working, why their rates of unemployment would be so much higher than their non-veteran peers. If you know vets, and the thing that I was always struck by when I was a young officer, where we'd be out on an exercise, no one step up, and I always think, what's the difference between me, coming from where I came from, and the young guys in my unit, right, which were all about your age? And the answer, I think, at the end was, the real only difference, really, was opportunity. That I've been very fortunate, had a number of opportunities that brought me to where I was. And those guys, those folks, had not, right? But in truth, they were probably smarter, more confident, and more trustworthy. Somebody you would trust with your safety. And a lot of the doofuses with whom I went to Millbrook. I'm not pointing at you at all, I'm just making a point. And also, and so, what is the difference? And if you're from Millbrook today, you're from a place, probably, and in a position where you have, at this point in life, almost an infinite range of choices and possibilities that are open to you. But if you're a kid from Modesto, California, or an inner city neighborhood, or a farming community in the Midwest, you might not have nearly as many choices, or anything like the same sense, and this is equally important, how the world works, how it connects together, in ways that might take you from where you are and where you might want to go. So as I was getting ready for my talk here tonight, Reverend Marty was good enough to send me a list of Millbrook alumni who have served in the military over the years. I think we're going to read some of those names. Is she okay? Okay. Who served in the military years. And so if you look at the World War II era, virtually every Millbrook student at that time, it was all boys school, served in World War II during that year. A giant number, a very high proportion. After that, and up through the last phase, Vietnam War, there was still a draft, but fewer Millbrook alums served. And as you look at the list, kind of pleasure today, it's typically one or two members of a class, every other class who served in the military. And so that's actually consistent with the rates in the rest of the country. The draft ended in this country in 1974, and that was at the height of the Vietnam War. So President Nixon saw discontinuing the draft as a political solution to a political problem. It was a way of trying to recalibrate and reshape the national conversation about the wisdom and impact of a war that had caused a great deal of pain to the nation. And so it made sense at that time, he thought, since we were disengaging from Vietnam, to recalibrate that conversation, to shift the basis for military service, when the draft had been such an issue. For a while, in the period between the end of Vietnam and the completion of the first Gulf War, the U.S. hadn't really figured out how to establish military with all volunteers, and there was real concern at the highest levels as to whether or not kind of this model, what they call the all-volunteer force, was sustainable. That's when I served. And then toward the end of this phase, especially after our success in the first Gulf War, the various branches of the military studied the practices of marketing and recruiting, and they eventually got really good at a certain kind of sales, right? To the point where they figured out how to go talk to those kids that are not like us kids, like you kids, for whom there aren't as many options, and present to them the military as their next best option. And so as a result of that, what we have in this country right now, I would say, and you have some students here originally, maybe 1 out of 10 young people who join the military join for truly patriotic reasons. You want to go be patriots, serve your country. The other 9 out of 10 are patriotic, don't get me wrong, but it's a very different calculation for them. For them, it's a way, it's their next best option. It's a way to, they're not going to college, to do something that points them in any direction, gets them out of their hometown, helps them hopefully find themselves. And so, over the past 12 years, we've had 2.5 million service members deployed to either Afghanistan or to Iraq. So 2.5 million is a very large number. But in a country of over 300 million people, it's really odd. I bet you that year's not so high. In a country of over 300 people, that's well below 1% of Americans, right? So that's a very small share. That's small enough that it's not unlikely or uncommon for many people to have never either personally known somebody who served in a conflict or to be related to somebody who served in the last 20 years. So how many of you, if you want to ask me, have either a family member who served in the military or who knows somebody personally who has served in the military? Not bad. That's your way above the norm. So there's a gap. And because of that gap between those who serve and those who they protect, we've come to live in what I refer to as the thank you for your service era. So when I was in the military, I don't remember anybody honestly thanking me for my service. I mean, not that it wasn't respected. And it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And so that tendency for people to thank those who serve is on one hand noble, but I think it's also a sign of a kind of national guilt or self-consciousness that recognizes that fact that only a very small percentage of our country is actually actively engaged in national defense. And so it's probably a good thing overall that we can staff a military with volunteers, but it has its negative consequences. And so I found in my work with veterans, I work with young vets who come home typically from far away, they're coming home to Southern California, that they've been thanked continually for their service. So it's one thing that an old guy like me come over to a soldier when they're passing through an airport or when they're on the plane and somebody offers them their seat or wants to buy them a drink and thank them for their service. It's a very different thing to ensure that after completion of that service, that we as a country and as communities are doing enough to match the appreciation, but to also make good on that obligation that we seem to be owed them, which is to get them to the next phase of their lives, to reward their service and move them forward as veterans into being productive members of their home communities. So, when you think about it, right, from the point of view of a young vet coming back, like I said, it's probably nice to be thanked for your service, but if you put yourself in their shoes, you join the military, say you join the Army from your little hometown right after high school, and for the first phase of your adult life, you do something really intense, generally far from home, and then when it's over, you leave an organization that trained you, took care of you, and to a very large degree told you who you were and what you were worth, and just importantly gave you a community of like-minded people whose values you shared and whom you knew shared yours. So then when you take your uniform off and you go home, not only are people no longer thanking you because you look like everybody else, they're no longer buying you drinks, the war you came home to is just as overwhelming and intimidating as it was when you left. And considering that your non-vet friends have now had all that time to figure things out on their end, it's probably even more intimidating, probably even more overwhelming. So there's an increasing catalog of data to bear this out. So in 2 surveys last year of veterans coming home to my area of Southern California, the researchers found the following kind of disturbing facts. And I'm going to read a couple. 61% of post 9/11 veterans, that's the year they served in, report challenges readjusting to civilian life. 74% of those veterans reported having no job and no job plan prior to leaving the military and returning to home. 71% of those vets report having received no help they regard as productive in coming home and finding post-service employment. Those who do find jobs were twice as likely than their non-veteran peers to be working in part-time jobs. More than 80% of them had no plan coming home for permanent housing arrangements. 25% report severe health issues from their military service that interfere with their post-service life. 40% report symptoms of probable PTSD or depression. 21% report engaging in risk-taking behaviors. 44% reported not knowing how or where to seek help. And here's the really scary part. 35% of young vets coming home have reported either considering suicide or actually making a plan. And you might have heard the statistics. So on any given day in our country, 22 Viet veterans kill themselves in the United States. And so clearly there is a gap between the thank you ethos and the experience they actually find themselves in. So clearly we need to do a whole lot better than that for those who have served. So the question is, what can you do as you sit here at Millbrook, considering your own future and your own values? So it's not for me to tell anyone what he or she should do. I understand how great you're playing and children in service. Good. Very commendable. But it's not for everybody. But consider, in today's world, which is truly dangerous, there's a lot of government programs that we can argue about, that should be changed, should be reduced, some should be scrapped. We'll always need a national defense. It is not going away. So the question is, who will serve, who will staff that national defense? If it's a very small proportion, there's something clearly inequitable about it. And it also has other indirect effects, such as ensuring that those who make the decisions that will lead our country to war are increasingly less likely to know either the folks who serve or the parents or the sons and daughters of those who serve. So another less altruistic reason I would say to also consider serving is it truly will be good for you. It will teach you who you are outside of the privilege, outside of your pedigree. And believe it or not, it'll also be, for the most part, very fun. Like I did, you'll get to see parts of the world you might otherwise miss. You'll meet real people of all kinds. And again, you'll get a sense of what it means to be part of something larger than yourself, which I would argue is a natural continuation of what you have here in Millbrook, with the true sense of community that Millbrook engenders. So the sense of value and identity comes from that, of knowing that you have served, knowing that you have value is precisely what Reverend Coughlin was getting at, and he stopped here to me 30 years ago. And even if you don't decide to serve, make sure to never forget that we are all better, we are all safer as a result of those who have served. And you should try to use that insight to do whatever you can to truly recognize them for their service, but also to assist them in moving into the next phases of their lives beyond the usual thank yous and once-a-year acknowledgments. I'd like to thank you all for giving me the chance, especially in this heat, to speak and spend time with you. I look forward to meeting more of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your story and your service, Mr. Newman. You help us to remember those in Millbrook history and in our own lives who are serving or who have served defending our country. I would like to draw your attention to the program which has listed members of our veterans or our extended Millbrook community. It's a long list, so we will now highlight those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for our country.
These men lost their lives in World War II. William Jared Knapp Jr., class of 1937, U.S. Army. Harrison Tweed Blaine, class of 1938, U.S. Army. Henry Lewis Austin, faculty member, 1940 to 41, U.S. Naval Air Force. Walter Phelps Hall, class of 1941, started in the U.S. Army. The story of sacrifice is written and framed and hangs in the office in the West Wing Howard House, as do the posthumous awards of the Silver Star and Purple Heart for his bravery in action in Italy in 1945. James Russell Parsons IV, class of 1941, U.S. Air Force, second lieutenant, awarded the Air Medal for brilliant and courageous service. Thomas Robert Bud Hazard, class of 1942, second lieutenant, U.S. Air Force. After 1 year at Princeton, Bud volunteered for U.S. Air Force service. Second Lieutenant Hazard participated in 40 combat missions before being shot down in Germany in 1944. Bud Hazard's portrait was painted and presented to the school and at 2 hands Mr. Anthony's office in the Howard House.
The following 2 alumni died during the war in Vietnam. Robert Edmund Coates Jr., class of 1961, first lieutenant, U.S. Army. John Robert Painter, Jr., class of 1962, lieutenant, U.S. Navy. The following graduate was killed in the war in Iraq. Skylar Montague Haynes, of class of 1985, U.S. Army. Skylar was killed in action by a roadside bomb in Iraq on November 15, 2006. Skylar enlisted in the U.S. Army, became a career soldier, and was a sergeant first class at the time of his death. The Skylar Montague Haynes Memorial Garden between Cowler House and Clark Hall was built and dedicated in memory of Skylar in 2008.
Before we close this service, I'd like to thank Catherine again for your wonderful words, and also to thank your wife, Darcy, for being here, and your buddy from your class.
Not my class, different class, but good guy, Paul Simon, how's he?
Welcome, Mr. Simons, and Carrie's dad. Lastly, I'd like us to, if you've had a chance to take a quick look at the long list of alums, you'll notice too that there are some people serving who are children of current faculty members or fairly recent graduates from Millbrook School. But I'd like us to take a moment to remember anyone and everyone in your own family and experience who has served, and to give honor them by having a moment of silence. But in addition, if you'd like to just put their name out there so that we can hear sort of a chorus of names, you're welcome to do that as well. So let us take some time to be quiet and to honor those people who have served in the Millbrook and extended community of Millbrook School. Thank you.